I really appreciate it. Thank you for that.
I feel like, I very much agree with you about Afro-pessimism, and we've had this conversation before. What sometimes to me feels a tad bit limiting, at least, is that I oftentimes feel like it's a situation, it's an either-or situation, and it's never like that for me. Like, if I think about blackness, of course I'm also thinking about death, but I'm also thinking about black culture. The two things happen simultaneously, right? Oftentimes, and I think that in the kind of institutional and an intellectual history moment that we're in, particularly in Black studies, even though it might not exist in the near future, I think that's already starting to happen in the United States, that Black studies departments are getting shut down, even though it seems like, there's all this accomplishment. One to remember is it's very, very recent. B, those are the first departments and units that are going to get shut down, and it has already started. But yeah, I feel like in these debates that it's like either you're a pessimist or an optimist. I don't know. It just feels like not only intellectually wrong to me, but actually politically, because it feels like that it's not getting at the situation. That I think in order to really do justice to whatever term we want to use, Black life, right? So for instance, that's something that I use, but for me, Black life is constitutively marked by death, even though it says life, right? So I think I want more and more rigorous discussion about how those two poles coexist intellectually, but also out there in the real world, so to speak.
I'm looking at the honey. How much time? We're still good on time? Okay. Then maybe a question on science fiction.
That's what we talked about on the ride over today.
So how would you relate to science fiction as a genre, as a form, as a gesture when it comes to speaking about blackness?
I think that for me, I think that the way I live intimately with that is in the realm of speculative thought, right? And I think that what we call quote unquote science fiction is also where people are imagining other coordinates of the world, where they're conceptualizing, other schemas that might arrange life. So I think that there's a call to imagine anew. It can be a domain for wild thought. Actually in Becoming Human, Zakiya Iman Jackson has also, and for you also use a word, ontologization or ontological plasticity and Becoming Human. So I think that there's something that there's a kind of an openness in the conceptual field because the coordinates are not given and fixed, and so yeah.
Just to add to that, I don't want to speak for you, but if I would put your work, particularly the work that was featured here, and to a certain extent Wayward Lives as well, into the tradition of Black science fiction, Black speculative fiction, I think it fits very well within that, because so much of that writing is not actually about the future, right? I'm thinking about something like Ishmael Reed's Mumbo Jumbo, Octavia Butler's Wild Seed. Those are kind of reimaginings of the history of Western civilization or the history of the New World, quote unquote, but from a science fiction lens. And I think that particularly those pieces, right, really fit into that. But I also think, critical fabulation, it's not science fiction, but it's also in the same neighborhood.
Yeah.
And one of the things, Palumi, in your practice, which I think also connects to this topic of science fiction, is the notion of speaking in tongues. Can you speak about that?
Yes, in what way?
In the thinking of the present and the future outside of the senses that we have now, outside of the intelligible.
Yes. Um, yeah. In relation to the play or
Your own practice.
oh, my own practice. I'm Nigerian, and I came here, and so my relationship to language is very playful, because I'm used to hearing so many different varieties of language, and usages of languages. I grew up in a multicultural neighborhood, and so for me, language has always been about attempting to understand, attempting to communicate, and never something to that captures anything, really. And so I speak from like continuous gaps in language, and so it's quite special that I am able to call myself a writer, or I am able to translate. And so when I am translating, the first draft is really in this same playful sense of like the first draft is the first translation, so the first interpretation of the text in itself, and that is already trying perhaps more rhythmically and translating rhythmically more than how would a Dutch person say this, and I don't think that is my task, and I let other people do that. But then we had a lot of like versions, and then so we have my free translation, and then we have like the belts I need to put on to make it correct. And then there are some editors or some translators, they would, perhaps they don't, I think we had the case where one of the copy editors perhaps didn't agree with the world building that was being proposed. And so there was like, we had to stop that person and really stay true to our interpretation. And then for me, the fun part in translating comes when I get to invent words. And I think one example would be in the tree, the Hayaku tree.
Yeah, Hijimako,
Yeah, that was like one part where I got to do almost like an oral play, like a sound. O levensbomen, and then you read like oh, life trees. But then when you would say it fast, it's like over levensbomen or over levende bomen. And I tried to add more of like these fun things in them, but they got rid of it. But like some parts were still kept. That's my answer.
Thank you. Amazing. I want to open it up to the audience. I think we have space for. Okay, so we've got a couple of questions. Here's one.
Firstly, I really just want to express gratitude for this space, especially for you, Saidia Hartman, because your work changed my life, honestly. Like, it's something I carry with me in my everyday practice as a wayward expressioner of freedom. So yes, I want to really begin by naming Assata Olugbala Shakur. The state calls her a criminal, and we call her kin, and now ancestor. When we grieve, mourn, and moan her name, we do the work the state forbids and criminalizes. We do archival ancestral work. We write history in the living. What struck me from a listening and the end of white supremacy was the song of our grief, was the fact that the song of our grief is both testimony and insurgency. So I asked, thinking of love as grief and grief as abolition, what do we do with our corpses? She's carrying this thing that she cannot name a child or a baby, but she carries it forward. And I'm really thinking of myself as an undertaker, as an embalmer. We are the mourners of this age. We are the archivists through our grief. So I really want to ask about the rituals around our corpses. Is this corpus seed? There's regeneration in our death.
Brilliant. Yeah, no.
What's your name?
My name is Chimera, and honestly, you know how people go to Beyonce and they're like, wow, like, this is me, I'm at Beyonce's concert right now. You are my Beyonce.
Yes.
No, but really, thank you for calling Assata Shakur's name, because particularly in this incredibly repressive period in the US, I feel like that calling her name and recognizing her life was actually happening in these secretive, furtive networks. Even Democracy Now!, it was like an online, just like examination of her life. And, in the exchange that I had with friends, we were like, she died free. She wasn't captured. She wasn't captured, and so just really, and the model and the thought of, that she has given us, and she is now an ancestor. So I think that because, I'm a gardener. I mean, I always say this thing, I want to be compost, not carnage, So I think that you're right, there's this kind of regenerative cycle and what that death yields, and Assata has so many daughters, so many followers, such a model of integrity. And actually, in the first movement, a character says, "It was time." And that's Assata. Before she made the decision to escape, she said she had a dream about her grandmother. And her grandmother said, and she says, "It was time." So you're right, that's her trace in the work, and that's the legacy for us.
And just to add very, very briefly to that, to me, one of the most important questions ever posed was by June Jordan. And it is, what do, we who did not die? And that seems to me the kind of, also going back to this earlier question of pessimism and optimism, that seems to me a much more honest and important question, because it is about death, but it's also, what do we do with our dead, right? Thank you for that.
For those who are interested, I think there's going to be a reading of Assata's work at Gemaal op Zuid soon. I don't have the date. Coming Thursday. And also on the 15th of October at the Black Archives in Amsterdam. So for those who are interested.
Thank you, Quincy. My question is, I look at this work and how it sits at the edge of the end of the world and looks out at the end of the world as a Rwandan. And I think about how this work gives us permission to be ongezellig. In the Dutch context, which is like, gezellig is like this word that says something about keeping things cute, keeping it cute. And being a Rwandan in the world, being a survivor of genocide, is a very ongezellig thing to move through the world with. So I'm wondering, even as how I call transatlantic slavery a genocide, I give myself that permission as a genocide survivor. So how do you think this is giving us permission to be ongezellig, Pelumi, to really sit with genocide, not as this thing that like, oh, this is such a frontal word and thing that we don't speak about, but actually sit in it and sit with that, yeah. Munganyende.
I mean, I'll approach your really, important question, observation, at an angle. And I think that, as Alex says, I mean, part of what defines our structural condition is this intimacy with death. So in a way, that's already, the horizon. And again, just in terms of some of the staging of the performance, there are certain kind of lines about life and freedom that are taking place. Again, scenes of great violence, extinction, and, the extremity of structural violence, whether in terms of massacres, state violence, all of that stuff. I mean, that's, the normative condition. I mean, Alex, Benjamin, just the state of emergency is the normative condition for the oppressed. So I think that what the work tries to do is to think about this question of Black existence at the end of the world, as that end of the world is presenting itself in our now, and that now can be 1863 or 1912 or 2020 or 2036, but it's the same. It's the same question of existence and how does one exist in the context of, the unlivable, in the context of the unbearable, and a context that has already assigned you to death, that has said you're disposable, you're fungible, your life has no normative value. And so I feel that, that's not unrelated to the very particular condition of a Rwandan genocide, but it's in that, that space of, the kind of just the massive production and tolerance for the death of particular populations. And I would say that, and there's a history of Black thinkers who earlier, William Patterson and Paul Robeson, they presented a petition to the UN in 1950 charging genocide. As soon as the word was invented, they charged it at Nuremberg. The head prosecutor, who was from the US, refused to embrace the word genocide, and he refused to do so because Southern senators were afraid that if the US used that word, that indigenous people and Black people inside the US would charge the US with genocide. Again, not as a distinctive event, but as a structuring condition.
No, and I think, again, to think about genocide as a kind of structural condition of the world that we that we live in, right? And not only think about it as something exceptional. Just to give you an example, I generally tend to say that Black people globally, not every Black person, live under the conditions of genocide, even now, right? In the aftermath of slavery and colonialism. That is the reality that most Black people face globally. And I said this publicly, and this was maybe 6 months after the October 2023, and then a person who was also in the room said to me, well, would you say what's happening in Palestine is genocide? And I'm just like, of course. Like, the Israeli state is genocidal. The United States is genocidal, right? I don't know the Netherlands state well enough to say that, but yes. I would assume yes. The German state definitely is, right? So I think that the modern state formation and its kind of origin in slavery and colonialism makes it more genocidal than not, right? And I think having that as a kind of reality and starting point is really important, because then it leads back to that whole question: what do, we who did not die, right? what is our task, right? We who are not Assata Shakur, we who were not killed, but who, were around it, right, and have to deal with it. So, thank you.
I saw a finger in the back here.
Sonorous thanks to all of you for this discussion. It's been really, really lovely. I actually wrote it down because I was like, I'm sure I'm going to get nervous while I'm talking. So I'm just going to read it. So now, perhaps more than ever, we sort of see the pitfalls of language, the ways that it can be described as slick-tongued. And I suppose my question, and that perhaps also ties into that earlier conversation that all of you were having around science fiction and speculative thought, how do you see poetry as a world-building form, register, echo, pitch? Yeah.
I first want to react to Mugayende on gezelligheid. Because while preparing for today, I was speaking to Simone Zeevaak, and I always tell her, like, I don't like speaking because ik ben geen gezellig persoon. There is a kind of, I find it really restricting, like the way you are supposed to present yourself in public spaces, in the Netherlands specifically, and the way you have to perform kindness and willingness and energy, which I most of the time do not have. And so, specifically in the second movement, Litany for Grieving Sisters, I had a conversation with my sister yesterday who came to the play with me. And before we had a conversation, and that was the first time, she shared something about her experience of her childhood. And I'm usually the one in the family who remembers and speaks. And this was a moment where she shared, and because she's the oldest, I think she has the responsibility of being demure or being gezellig or facing the expectations of the outside world. And I have the privilege of not doing that. And so when the part of the wailing came on without language, it was also the installation on itself of the tree and them entering the tree. That's poetry in itself, just the imagery and the kind of world building, like the option it gave us towards the end. But that's another part. I think while watching that, I experienced, while watching and hearing the wailing, I experienced like a space for very old and deep feelings that are not gezellig. And it felt cross-generational, without language. And so, going back to the position of poetry, I think it offers that space because you don't have to be intelligible and or logical, and you can place things next to each other. Intuitively or like spiritually or like whatever you're feeling, and to some people it will come across and to some people it won't, but the way Saidiya Hartman writes is really dense, full of imagery, and so the first part was really, really difficult, and then the second part with the letters to a sister, I felt also a space to grieve while translating itself. Yeah.
I mean, I think of like poesis rather than poetry, and I think of a kind of literary and social poesis together. And I mean, I think, Césaire's poetry and cognition, and I think that there's a way that, regarding language, I mean, what's a line, what's a page, how do you arrange thoughts, or the materiality of language and its vehicles is what poetry puts into question. So it, Jan Brown always says, poetry teaches us to read, yeah.
And how would that relate to songwriting as well, in terms of songwriting and poetry and?
I guess I would say that it sort of gets to the limits of intelligibility and language, right? That's what poetry and song both do. For me, and that's what I think also the different parts yesterday in the performance also did for me, right? That the first part with the TV screens, that did a particular kind of thing in terms of visibility and breaking up like the perspective. Then when Andre Holland was on stage, it did something else in terms of embodiment and sound. And then of course, the last two movement sounds was I don't know if they're categorized as two movements. I'm just gonna say that.
There's three movements of the last movement.
Okay, so the first one was one together. So the second movement and then the third movement, sound was so central, and I think that really, it pointed to me the kind of the limits of language. And then I think, just to go back to where we started, of course also the limits of translatability, right? Not only in terms of Blackness, but just in general, that there is always that limit where, you kind of have to gesture to other planes. Perhaps not have to, but that's what happens frequently. And I think that's where poetry, songwriting, production, right, filmmaking, et cetera, and so on, when it is interested in those things, comes in for me.
This has been a wonderful conversation. We are out of time. I saw some more fingers. I'm gonna look at, see, just one. Yes.
Thank you so much. First of all, my name is Malaika. I'm very fulfilled to be here. My question entails, in Litany for Grieving Sisters, you illuminate care as a burden and a refusal. And I've been thinking about how, quote, being the man is also the act of being a mother, stepping up in ways that often require some kind of desensitization. I don't know if that's the word you would use. The quote I'm pulling from is, she must be the man, she must carry it all, she must shoulder the burden until she is exhausted, end of quote. And maybe not a man in form of white supremacist patriarchy, but in response and refusal to it. So I guess my question is, could you speak on how you understand the negotiation between care, desensitization, and militancy in the work of grieving?
That's an easy one. I think in Litany for Grieving Sisters, I think about this, incredible capacity that Black women have for nurturing, for care, the brilliance that's required to make social reproduction even possible in conditions of great deprivation, the kind of genius required to kind of reproduce life for yourself and for others, and wanting to underscore that as a capacity, but also to think about its other dimension, which is like an imposition and a requirement and a demand, and also the kind of the structural demands on Black women's caring labor to reproduce this order in which we are so devalued. So I wanted all of that complexity to exist. Joy James has this great notion of the captive maternal, and really just kind of thinking about, and it's looking at mothers of the movement in terms of mothers of the slain, sisters of the slain, thinking about Eric Garner's daughter who died a few years after him, and all the kind of the labor that was required to sustain that work of the movement. So I think it's both to to honor and to really to question about that, you know, to question that demand and to talk about that, that depletion, that, you know, absolute extraction of every capacity, and then to think about the ways in which it is also, like, you know, utterly gender non-conforming too, so that one is required, you know, in that maternal labor to kind of like, to show up as a man and take care of it all at the same time. So I think Dead River also, the shift from litany to Dead River is that I feel that we're in a different space because we're in the space of these sisters attending to one another and, you know, kind of like finding a language of becoming together.
Give a warm round of applause for Alex, Sadia, Kalun.
So yeah, so now we have a little break, and the second conversation will be at 2:30. So please be on time.
Ready? Ready? Okay. We're going to get started again. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Now it's time to be quiet, everyone. Now it's time to take your seats again. We're at that time. We're at that time. That's right. Everyone's being very, very compliant. I appreciate that. Appreciate it. So we want to maximize the amount of time for this second conversation after that stunning first conversation. So can I welcome people back into the room? There are seats. Make yourselves comfortable. I'm not going to reintroduce this afternoon because we've already gotten a taste of the conversation that we want to have, that we can have, and what is possible so far. So I am going to hand over to our next wonderful moderator, Darika. Please take it away.
Hello, everyone. My name is Darika Shields, and to my left is Precious Okoyomon, installation artist for for minor music. Cameron Rowland, who was the archive supervisor.
Definitely not the supervisor.
I'm sorry.
Never the supervisor.
No, I love this. Keeper of the archive. Okay. Oh, that's
attendant is what you call me. Attendant.
Attendant. That's amazing because that's a Google Translate thing, right? Like it turns it into supervisor. Attendant of the archive is even better. But I also wanted to ask about supervisor. Amazing. Professor Saidiya Hartman, who you all know, and the artist Arthur Jafer, who was the film and video artist for minor music. Okay, today I also, interestingly, wrote a small text by way of introduction that was this kind of invocation of Assata Shakur. So I was really moved that she already came up and was already kind of revered and honored. And maybe where I'll try to enter that text is the point at which I was thinking about this question of whether she died free, right? It became this big argument, actually, online. And I'll read, I won't try and freestyle. But I've been witnessing this argument about whether Assata died free. Those who use the word are usually talking about her escape from the US prison system and that she did not die in a cage. Others advise against using the word free to describe exile and estrangement from your loved ones, who are in turn subject to continued surveillance, continued imprisonment. On October 5th, 2013, so almost to the date, right? We're on the October 4th. October 5th, 2013, Assata Shakur published an open letter that began, "My name is Assata Shakur, and I am a 20th century escaped slave." And that went on to say both, "I do not have a voice," and "all I have is my voice." This contradiction makes perfect sense to me, and it made me think about the way Professor Hartman's Scenes of Subjection excavates the paradox of abolition. Quote, "The recognition of the slave's humanity and status as a subject extended and intensifies servitude and dispossession. So the attributes of the human, will, consciousness, reason, agency, and responsibility were the inroads of discipline, punishment, and mortification." Sorry to quote you in front of you, that's probably weird. But I've also been enlivened by people pointing out that Assata is an ancestor now, because this speaks to me of the aliveness and even resurgence of Black, quote, New World diasporic practices of revolutionary genealogy, of resuturing of syncretisms that were torn apart, ripped up, desecrated, and criminalized by Euro-America's violent imposition of Christianity's jealous God that cannot hold complexity and that softens us up to kind of panoptic violence and surveillance. These practices are adaptive and always reimaginable. They respond to the place we're in, and they respond to the place they were crafted. The refusals, resistance, counter-assertions, uprisings, revolt, and militant organization they made possible is within the scope of possibility again. And I guess I want to go from there right into talking about the sun in minor music, The End of the World. Because the sun, and in your work, the work of all of the kind of contributions that made up minor music. The sun kind of appears, retreats, and is this sort of ambivalent figure. It made me think about how in some forms of astrology, the sun is the object, the planet that we're meant to associate ourselves with. That's the self, that's the ego. And then there are other forms of studying astrology that prioritize the moon and the lunar. And I think of Nat Turner kind of pointing out that the moon, or the eclipse, the solar eclipse, was going to be this point of uprising. And this kind of sun disappearing, appearing, disappearing at the end of the world in the video the video work that closes minor music. So maybe I can ask you to speak to that, Professor Hartman, and then maybe also you, Arthur J. Phil. Can I? Yeah, I know. Do you know I did the thing of asking Professor Hartman how I should address her, and she said you can introduce me as Professor Hartman and then Saidiya Hartman. But can I call you AJ? AJ is better. Okay. Thank you. These are my elders. I can't. So maybe this figure of the sun, if it's of interest.
I love the work Black Sun. So there's a way, Black Sun, Cristeva, Black Beach, Glisson. But I think I was thinking also a lot about Du Bois' Dusk and Dawn, and the way that dusk and dawn are weighted with certain possibilities, you know, a freedom or the weight of a certain kind of enclosure. And with this whole minor music thing, I mean, there are all of these networks of friendship and collaboration that not only, like, you know, are now like added contributions, but that form the work. And I can remember, you know, when AJ was working on something that wasn't even a Gidra, it was kind of like you were calling it like the wave. And I was writing the end of white supremacy, and we were talking a lot about the Plantationocene, the Anthropocene, and blackness, and what is blackness at the end of the world. So I think that whether, you know, that black wave, I mean, it's both threatening and it's so beautiful. It's such like the landscape of the possible. So that's all I'll say, but maybe anybody wants to say.
Well, for me, you know, I could say the sun in particular. The sun is a motif in my work at this point, a certain motif. I like to think of it a bit as like a philosopher's stone. You know, it's there to think about. It's not like it has a fixed meaning or anything like that for me. Initially, the first time I used it as a motif, of course, would be like in Love is the Message. You know, when people ask me questions about it, that was the one question I got more than any other question. What's with the sun? How come we contend the sun? And I used to say it has a structural function because we tend to look at black people's lives like that. But when you see the sun, you always orientate yourself like that. And we should continue to look at black people's lives like that. You know what I mean? Looking up as if it's big, it's cosmic, it's not parochial, it's not small, it's not, you know, a minor kind of thing. And it's just carried on. So like now when it pops up in my work, it does whatever it's doing in the particular context. In the context of a Gidras, you know, there to define the horizon in a sense, like when you see it pop up at a certain point. You know, you can, I mean, the wave is at its scariest or maybe / most magnificent when you see it in relationship to the sun, because all of a sudden you have a reference when it's rising and falling in those big kinds of ways. But, you know, another thing I would say just in general about minor music, you know, it's funny, I worked as my vocation for 30, 40 something years of my life was as a cinematographer. So I'm very practiced in terms of, you know, cinematographers support directors' visions. Like, you know, a lot of people would first have heard my name in relationship to Daughters of the Dust, which Julie directed, you know what I mean? So I made my living helping or supporting accompanying directors as they approach their vision. So it's something I never felt diminished about it. I cherished that moment. I saw and met incredible people just by showing up to work with directors. You know, I got answers to questions I wouldn't have even known to ask. You know, I met and got to hang out with Asada Shakur in Cuba. I hung out with Audre Lorde like the last 2 weeks of her life, like quite literally, because I shot what's the name of the documentary? Litany for Survival, yeah. So I shot that. So you know what I mean? So I've just met the most incredible people just because I was accompanying a director who had a vision and was going somewhere. So it's something I cherish. I don't get to do it as much now because thankfully, I'm in this, hopefully, I hope I can stay here. I can stay in this part of my career where I'm doing kind of what I want to do. So, you know, this was an opportunity to flex a muscle I think is very developed in me. And yeah, you know, and she knows this, I only can make this time for anybody but her because I'm trying to get my shit done before I'm out of here. So, yeah.
Precious, I wonder whether you wanted to speak about the sun, which also is this recurring figure in the titles of your shows and in your work. And you also talk about Etel Adnan, and I wonder if there's anything there for you.
The sun is so deep for me as a place of consciousness and like vision, I don't know, being an actual source of continuous like light for everything on the planet, but also this like, I don't know, I see this kind of radical actual blackness of the sun, of being like the actual source of like light in the world. Yeah.
Yeah.
Nice, thank you. A big, broad question I had, right? And maybe this relates to those moments where we see the horizon or we see the kind of, you know, I wasn't really thinking about it as water at the end. It's funny, there was somehow, it felt to me like the broken up mantle of the earth. And there I was thinking about this distinction that you were drawing out actually in the first conversation between earth and world. And the question of like world building came up too. There's a sense that like it's sort of like the distinction between land and earth. It's like land gets annexed and is dominated and is the thing that can become property. It's like the thingifying of earth. And then there's something that surpasses that. And so I was thinking, I'm thinking about this, thinking about the question of like scale. So if in all of your work I see this kind of play with scale, Precious, you talk about kind of wanting to create these completely immersive worlds that kind of hijack all of the senses to put people in place. And then right at the, I mean, I'm sorry for the people who haven't experienced the performance already, but this kind of moving into the tree, kind of this portal out of the world into the earth somehow, it was really moving for me as well. Cameron, I think about the way your work engages scale and is always on one level, on one level looking at these like very, I mean, violent but mundane objects, and then kind of pointing to their implication in the horror that we're living, in the structures that we live in that constrain us. Even on the cover of the new edition of Scenes of Subjection, there's this work, Society, and maybe, I don't know if you want to speak about that, but I find that such a moving work. I'm from the UK, and it speaks quite directly to kind of how much of the entirety of the UK, the entirety of our like state formations are like the product of this corruption, this initial corruption. I could keep talking about scale, but maybe I'll, in your works, but yeah, maybe I'll start there and then I'll offer like a more kind of generous question to Saidiya and AJ once you two have answered. Is that all right?
Thanks for that beautiful question.
I was thinking a little bit about your distinction between world and earth, and while we were sort of all experiencing the previous panel, and I think that the questions of nationalism as a organizing principle of our world is something I feel like to even begin to understand slavery, we have to abandon. And for me, that means that the scale of the world, which is that is the system that we live in, like we have to think of it differently. And for me, my contribution to this project is primarily this essay that circulates through the performance and is handed out at the beginning, and it draws heavily on Giovanni Arrighi and Fernand Braudel's conception of world systems analysis and the importance that they assign to the what they call the Dutch systemic cycle of accumulation within the building of our modern world and the system of capital that structures it. And the thing that is absent that I feel like, even though I'm engaged with their work, that I'm always sort of trying to write against is not just the absence of slavery, but an understanding of the interaction between this sort of macro scale and the minor key. And what I've learned from Saidiya's work so crucially that, the ways in which Black practice operates at the minor level, working slowly, leaving the plantation, these kind of transgressions that perpetually limit the horizon and the scale of potential accumulation and of actual accumulation, those are unworldly, and those are the parts of our shared world, or what what I'm kind of interested in maybe in talking about here is the way that this even the collaborative form of building this is a sort of reinstantiation of the Black mass, and to me that's how we sort of actually contend with the imperceptible scale of the world.
I'm always thinking through like Blackness as unmovable earth. It's probably why I make gardens all the time. I think so much with soil, dirt, like this kind of like agential reality that's continuously like stuck in time. And so much of like when I think about trees and soil or like archive history of rocks, these things that have like ancient memory, ancient time, is then how one of my favorite books of poetry is Ed Roberts' To See the Earth Before the End of the World. And that's such a foundational tool to how I think, is like to see the earth before the end of the world, to continuously like inhabit that, and what is the actual like poesis of that, which it's always seed saving, world building, that melding, and then it blurs. Yeah, and the scale is endless, and like it's geological time.
I guess, AJ, you already touched on planetary scale and this kind of corrective of looking up at the action, what I think you say, what Black people do, right? Like, and I guess one way that or a question I have maybe about what else this kind of rescaling of things does, is, do we, if like, I mean, and I don't know if any of you accept this that I'm about to propose, but if we have this like kind of disgusting calculation where blackness is 0 and man, human, is always 1, right? And that's white, you know. Then, and I was just talking about this with Sean D. Henry Smith, like then you always have this deficit, this kind of thing, this amount that you have to make up in order to count, actually. And so one thing that scale might do, or kind of doing violence to that scale, or rescaling, is to make that metric almost irrelevant. I don't know, there's something about what you said, AJ, that kind of made me think of that, like, you know, look up at it. But do either of you have anything you want to speak to that?
No, can I answer that by asking you a question? Like, what is Denise's, the article with the algorithm that's precisely about that calculation of 0 minus 1? Yeah, but it's a way of like dealing with that. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Would you like a mic? Okay. Becoming human. Yes.
Okay, so is the question like, what's the name of the Denise article? Are you asking me to weigh in on the?
Yeah, because partly it's about taking up that calculus and actually breaking it. Let's say.
Yes.
I'm not beyond the equation.
So I have a couple of thoughts. I think that I was thinking a lot about geology as an anti-Black science and about geography as an anti-Black science. And so I think engagement with the question of scale, I think it's important to take a few steps back and think about the ways that our understanding of scale is already conditioned by anti-Blackness, and that it presumes a certain world picture. And the question, at least from my perspective, of world is so complicated because there's so many worlds. And so the question of the world is one that is only made possible through the destruction of other competing senses of world. And so I always want to keep the question of world open so that the world is not assumed to be the only world that exists, and the only world in this contest over what happens at the level of Earth or at the register of Earth. And then also that when I've thought about the question of world, I've also thought about it in a relationship to someone like Jacob van Uxkol, who's written in relationship to worlding of insects and perspectives of insects, and that there's so, that humans are not the only ones that have worlds. And of course, if we think about the philosophy of someone like Martin Heidegger, that question of the capacity to world and have a world is racialized and it's anthropocentric. And so I want what we imagine world to be to multiply and to understand the texture and the friction in these competing conceptions of world. And what imperialism is trying to do is make one conception of world the world. And so for me, the question of Earth is inseparable from the question of whose world is made the dominant frame, because Earth is caught up in that net of this contest over worlds. And so they're this a Mobius strip, right? And so I want the Earth liberated from world, but Earth is already inside of world in terms of these geology, geography. And so to me, Earth is not outside, but deeply embedded. But when we talk about Earth, we're in this kind of catachresis where we want Earth to point to this thing that we can only gesture towards. We can't actually have direct access to Earth because world is constantly being imposed on us.
Thank you so much. That was, yeah, I'm a big being human geek, as I was explaining to Zaki before this. Okay, yes. I wonder then about like to think about this act of bringing these essays onto a stage or the stage. And a term that came up a lot in the previous conversation was world building. And the decisions you have to make to bring something that is, I guess, on a part of a text and differently visual into kind of performers' bodies and out of their mouths. And so I wonder how you, and maybe this is part of the tension with the wordplay, I don't know, versus performance. I wonder if there's like something that you were thinking around like the onus on you probably to world build in some way.
And I guess I would just have an asterisk to, Zaki, I mean, I think that end of world is precisely about the world. And I think that, I mean, I think you're right that there's a way that kind of like Earth could be ideality of that world, but my friend Mabel says, you know, she says, everyone on the planet builds, but only the West has architecture. And I think like everyone on the planet exists, you know, has a relationship to soil and earth, but only certain people have worlds. And so for me, you're right, it's just a way of like marking this differentiated territory, but I totally, you know, like understand that point. I think that there's, you know, the demand placed on the blackened person is to always, you know, to redeem bankrupt structures, you know, and there's a particular like kind of burden that's placed on, you know, Black people to kind of generate hope in the order. And one of the things that I wanted for Mine and Music, I mean, I think that there's so much beauty in it, but I also wanted it to be like brutal too. I wanted it to feel unbearable, because that task of, you know, needing to provide that redemptive possibility is another way in which we're called to service, and we're called to service for projects that don't actually serve, you know, us. And it's, you know, so that's how I would, you know, answer that. And I think that, like, you know, Precious, I mean, I had this relationship to soil, you know, I make my partner angry because I will leave my gardening gloves like on the dining room table, and he'll say, that's dirty. I'm like, that's not dirt, that's soil. That's soil, that's like, you know, that's generating life. And I think that there's these kind of like, you know, the range of quotidian and everyday practices of tending to earth and of making life. And for me, that's kind of what, you know, that maybe like earth is trying to be a shorthand for, even as it's not outside, even as it's not, you know, the free territory. And, you know, I think you started off asking something about, and was it, and I don't know if it was the minor, the proper subject. What was your first question? Yeah, and but I guess I was thinking about, you know, maybe scale, maybe it's related to scale, and maybe it's about the minor and the potentialities that reside in the minor. And so I think that that's about, for me, that's a register of like of possibility, of opening, of becoming.
And I feel like one of the ways we talked about it through working on this is also, and maybe you could correct me if I'm wrong, but that's also, that the minor is also the sort of perpetual unworlding. That it's that unworlding actually is happening, and it's constant, and that the sort of the logic of the world, the logic of continuous perpetual accumulation, it doesn't even recognize. Just like Mabel said, you know, it's like all of the buildings that are in architecture are the unworlding of the world.
Yeah, yeah. And there's a book by Nefertiti Tadiart, and it's called Remaindered Life.
Yeah.
And it's about these zones where, all value has been extracted, but yet there's something that remains, and in that remainder,
Yes.
there's something that's, produced. I mean, I don't know if you're going to ask us a question about collaboration, but I just want to say how, important the people on the panel are, here. So I just want, partly it's about honoring, the gifts that all these, people have, how much the people here have made possible for the work and its presentation. And I would hope that's also a part of like this unworlding, this kind of generosity and opening of thought and sharing of thought that happens among us.
Yeah, I was going to ask about the, I guess, the various points of inception for minor music. I remember, I've watched a conversation between you and AJ about Wayward Lives. And there's a point where AJ is like, next time write a novel or something like this, does it, and sort of pulling you in or urging you in a certain direction maybe, as a collaborator and a witness of your practice. And I know that you and Cameron, and that Cameron and conversations with Cameron were really important to you as you were revising and updating Scenes of Subjection. And then I know, Precious, that you invited Saidiya to Rome and to work on these texts that have formed the basis of minor music. So maybe you can each speak about, or all speak together, about kind of how minor musics came to be, through these kind of ongoing conversations and challenges also.
Well, like Saidiya was saying in the beginning, it's like the ground of all of this is just our friendships, I think, and intellectual exchanges, like with no necessarily product in mind. I mean, it's really important to have people in your lives who don't have to, you don't have to footnote yourself when you're talking to them. You can just talk like freely, just freely, like free associate in front of or with another person. And so, I mean, one of the things, like for me, I know it's like I hate when people call certain aspects of my work archival. I get some oh man, archival fever. Everybody's read archival fever, But they get into this whole thing, like if you take like Love is the Message, say for example, one of the defining aspects of that is that I just took what I wanted, And I didn't take it from an archive, I took it from YouTube, which is not an archive, right? Not classically speaking, it's not an archive. It's just a repository of things that are, I think, at least as interesting as authored things, Not that there aren't authors on YouTube, but you know what I mean. The people who post things on YouTube don't have the same status as authors. They're just posters or something like that.
They may have more status.
Well, they might have more fiscal status or something now, but I'm laughing at myself. But it's like really interesting to me, like around this whole idea of the accompaniment. Like it's something. Is what I was trying to talk about a little bit when I was talking about being a cinematographer. Like one of the highest representations of artistry and expressivity in the Black American continuum, I would say, is the organist in the church. Like in a way, the organist in the church has got more flow than the sermonist. The sermonist is talking, but the organist is back there free associating, but underlining and accentuating and amplifying what the sermon or the speaker is actually saying. So, like to me, it's something like my friend Carrie James Marsh, I have to say, so people know. I wouldn't just say Carrie, but like he came in New York in the 90s once. He was living in Chicago. I was in New York, and we had dinner like we often did. And I had been thinking about photography and painting a lot. And I said, hey, Carrie, as the painter that I knew intimately, hey, what's the difference between painting and photography? And without hesitation, he said, discrepancy. And it's like something that has just stuck with me and resonated with me for like going on, like 30 years now, literally, of all the things Carrie has ever said to me, because also there was no hesitation. He said discrepancy. And so I think so much about discrepancy and a kind of contestation of, you could say it's a contestation of meaning in a way, but it's like more strictly speaking, it's a contestation of something like signification, meaning like there's a sign, we all agree there's a sign, but then there's a lot of contestation about what that sign signifies, what its signifier is. Like a lot of when we say the distinction between world and earth, it's like that kind of stuff. A lot of the struggling or contestation that's going on in the world is around defining the terms of our mutual existence, right? When you say, like when we talk about the world versus the unworld, worlding, architecture versus building, all these kinds of things. So, like to me, one of the things that's interesting to me about, because I've been thinking a lot about my place in this contingent of people, you know? And a lot of it is like, okay, I have taken other people's work non-consensually, and now in a way I'm making myself available to be sampled in a way, because a lot of my work would be termed sampling. Like Love is the Message is sampling, but now I'm being sampled. You know what I mean? Does that make sense? So like say with a Ghidra, like you said, we talked about it. We were talking a lot about it before it had a name or anything. And if we wanted to talk about how it came about, there's so many points where I could say, oh, this is when it came about. Like I was in Tokyo with my son and his friend, and we were walking around Shibuya Square or whatnot, and Godzilla was in the movie theaters. And they had the biggest billboard I literally have ever seen in my life. It was like 5 stories high. It was on the side of a skyscraper. And they didn't know anything about Godzilla, and they said, what is that? And what is that about? And I said, oh, that's Godzilla. They said, oh, we want to go see it. I said, I don't want to see it. I grew up seeing Godzilla movies. So they went in, they came out, and they were shaking their heads. And they said, what was that about? We don't quite understand it. He wasn't a bad guy, Godzilla. He was just like knocking shit down, you know? You know what I mean? But he wasn't a bad guy. He was just, and I said, oh, well, in simple terms, Japanese people are the only people who've ever had an A-bomb dropped on them. And on a psychosocial level, it was their response to trying to embody whatever that is, to have an A-bomb dropped on you. Godzilla is the embodiment of that. And in that moment, I said, wow, that's interesting. I wonder if it's possible, what would an embodiment of the Black experience that wasn't a sociological embodiment, which is what we're mostly used to, what it would have looked like. And that's in a way where Ghidra came about. So it's very interesting to have a very specific understanding of it, concrete, specific, but now to see it in the context being re-signified or something in the context of minor music where it does overlap, but it diverts. So that's a discrepancy thing. And that's what makes it, like if you go to see it at night, it's like I'm saying I'm a person who's in it, but also seeing it, like even from the dress rehearsal to the performance, there's things that are astonishing in it. Like truly like astonishing. I've seen a lot of theater, things in it that are just, I will never forget, so, don't want to give it away, but like for real, like I'm being a hype man now, go see it. Yeah.
I mean, I think that, AJ helped Sarah and I Sarah Benson, the director, build the architecture of the show. I mean, we were literally in BAM talking about like, oh, how do we transform 2 essays into a performed work? How is it that we, do that? And so that was critical. And then in the essay itself, I mean, a lot of my writing is ekphrastic. And so there's a whole ekphrastic passage about Cameron's ICA show. I mean, most people don't get it, but there's a way that when I'm talking about, like, I mean, I'm really just kind of like, I'm quoting from him and I'm reflecting on his practice. So that's about, you know, the structures that are embedded inside the work. And I just think that, you know, Precious was like, oh, really just wanting to think with Oakley and I about collaborative practice and inviting us to come and play. Like, oh, I'm doing this thing in Rome, come play with me. We're like, sure. And then I said, Tina, come along, be the dramaturg of our play. And so again, it's very, you know, just very organic, not product oriented. And, you know, Precious and I were joking. I mean, we produced, it was like, Ostia was just very raggedy, you know, what happened. But we were still able to, you know, the Hartwig generously came forward and said, Mike. The Hartwig, you know, came forward and just kind of supported this process. And it feels, you know, really wonderful because even as we're producing, you know, our work, there are all of these enclosures that we're still inside of. I mean, you made a comment, you know, casually about the cover of Scenes, which has a great work of Cameron's on the cover called Society, which is all about the history of kind of like British slavery and, you know, the society, Codrington, and the way they would brand the chest of slaves with the word society, because it was short for Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. I could not use that cover in the UK. I could not. It just wouldn't be understandable to our readers. This is your history. There's a college named after Codrington. So that there's a way that, you know, we're working, we're pushing, and then we're still fighting against the structures to actually, for the possibilities of articulating what it is we make.
So it was rejected, the cover?
Absolutely rejected. Absolutely rejected. What did they put on the cover? A cotton bowl. And that's also about trying to make what was a transatlantic global experience into a shorthand of like a U.S. experience.
Yeah, massive displacement. Codrington is the name of a library in Oxford University. So, you know, yeah.
You know, I mean, I think, oh, is this one on? Yeah. I think that, you know, and I guess the other, it's the friendship and it's also this, like, this extended form of collaboration that's not, that this is, you know, a node of, because of course, the essay that I wrote for the ICA show was deeply indebted to Scenes. And so, you know, it's a great honor that, you know, you quoted it back in the text. And I feel like the conversation, I don't know, I mean, you know, one of the things that I think I continually learn from and admire about your methodology, Saidiya, is your commitment to the quarrel, to the impossibility of individuality. And I think that it's like a deep, you know, minor harmony between that methodology and what you're working on, and I think it kind of affects and impacts all the people around you and the people that are thinking with you. And you know, I mean, there's this this question that, you know, I'm always kind of thinking about, which is what does it mean to not just be indebted, but to be the debt? What does it mean to, like, be the underside of capital, to be the thing that was accumulated? And so, you know, I've really been thinking a lot this past year about this passage in Black Reconstruction where Du Bois is referring to the Black worker as the Black mass, and thinking about really the capacity that built into that, and how thinking against the category of the individual and working against it in the way that you do and bring us together to do, it's not just a sort of an ideology or an act of selflessness. It is activating the latent threat that the underside of capital holds.
Maybe we can open for some questions. How are you feeling? Yeah?
Hi, my name is Melat, and I'm a linguist. So when I heard Arthur speak about signifier, signified, and the way meaning is always deferred, and meaning is created through association, really spoke to my heart. And I was talking to Sadia, also Professor Hartman, about how I'm a fan of psychoanalysis and how, Lacan says that the unconscious is associative and structured as language. And also the performance is very associative as well. And you spoke about the difference between theater and performance. Theater has a very clear script, has rules. Performance is, always, the meaning is always deferred. You can never grasp a thing. So my question is, coming from academia, why performance? It's very, basic, and it's sort of, the underlying question, but why performance? Why embodiment?
I mean, performance and the larger category of practice, is very central to scenes of subjection. And so examining whether it's unworlding, these practices that are utterly recalcitrant to capitalism and antagonistic to structures of ownership. I mean, really looking at performance was the domain in which I was trying to recover the radical thought and imagination of those who were enslaved. So performance was central. And then I met, Okwakwasili, and so I had this relationship to thinking about performance, but just also what I learned about performance through her practice. I mean, I didn't ever had any conscious intention to I want these two essays to be a performance piece. There were a certain set of fortuitous accidents and contingencies which led to minor music, but I feel so grateful. I think I tend, someone last night in a Q&A said, so why is it that you revere art or something like that? I was like, I don't revere art. And so, but I think it's but what I revere are these multiple forms and modalities of thinking, of presenting ideas, of advancing questions, and performance is a vital domain of doing that. So I don't feel like I'm, I mean, it is a world that I know very little about, so that this kind of, in terms of being a maker in that space, but I think that, all of us, on this panel, think about a set of shared questions, how we go about approaching it and articulating that, or the kind of the materials we use to make a set of propositions differs, but it's a shared activity. And I mean, partly the first time I met Cameron, but the first time he really commanded my attention was he said something like, "Oh, I do Black study in the domain of art practice." And I was like, and for me, that was just about oh yeah, there are all these practices that we're involved in, and a set of critical questions that we're all inhabiting, and we just do them in our different domains.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Taruna. Thank you all for being here. It's a privilege. I've been thinking about this question for a long time, and I don't know if it fits into this space specifically, but I'm going to ask it anyway because it's now or never. So I've been thinking about language a lot, and this is something that we've always also been hearing here, which is being discussed, how do we use words? But also how do we use language? And performativity is also a form of language, I think, or performances. And I think about language a lot because my grandmother couldn't read or write. And I'm always thinking about how can you tell this thing to a person who cannot read or write? And so I think my question is, and I'm thinking about this question specifically for someone like, if I may call you AJ as well, thank you. Is this something that you also think about in your work when you're creating the work, about how do certain feelings or rhythms or modes of movement translate in a way that doesn't need words?
I mean, I was going to push back on this whole idea that it's all language, but yeah, I mean, I would say the world of not language is way, way more bigger than the world of language. Language is struggling to commensurate, to create some understanding of the world, but it will never, never, never be able to match the world of unlanguaged, the illegible. Yeah, the illegible, you know what I mean? So, like, yeah, so your grandmother didn't need to read or write, because right.
But I'm always like, no, my voice is not enough. But I'm always thinking about like how when I make work or when people around me make work, I'm always thinking about how would she read this? How would she understand this? Because if you don't have the language or the words or the understanding, then how do certain feelings and concepts translate?
Yeah, but the thing I would say is, like, and again, this is getting into semantics now, but because it's not about reading. Reading is not the only way of processing or understanding the world. World. It's not the only way of processing the world, and neither is language the only way of declaring in the world. There are all these, like a moan, like we were talking about moaning, the other night, right, Precious, as we were going to the hotel. But a moan is interesting precisely because it's somewhere in between language and non-language, That's why it's interesting. So I would say it's not an either or, like most things in the world. It's not an either or. Like, I'm a big yapper, as everybody knows. I like to yap. But at the same time, I'm quick to say, talking can be overrated too, It's like in certain contexts, I lean into talking is overrated because talking is overrated in that context. But in other contexts, I'm constantly saying to people, hey, yeah, but what's your theory about that? How do you articulate that? What's articulate? But articulation is one modality of communicating. And there's other modalities that are not articulating. There's something else that maybe we don't have the language to articulate that. I don't know. But we know there's so much in the world that's happening that is not language. It just lies outside of language. And then language will come up and try to shape or some understanding of it, but that's always contingent, as we know, right? You come up with a word, happy. We all agree we know what happy is until somebody asks you, are you happy? People ask me all the time at my openings. I always get asked, am I happy? And it always freezes me because I'm like, well, that's phenomenological. You know what I mean? Like, in this moment, I'm not feeling a lot of endorphins, but it's a good night, You know what I mean? It's just like happy then fails. In that moment, it fails. So in my work, it's definitely, like Agidra's way, it's built to be something that calls for words on one hand, but it tries to exist outside or beyond language. It's really trying to be in the space of what we just we just reflect, say, feeling or something like that.
I'm always thinking on about this book, On the Way to Language, and that's a pretty big way. I always say I'm a poet before I'm an artist, because it just is. I know the world is poetry, and everything that I'm forming is always like a feel knowing on the way to language. I don't know the end of it or the practice, or really it's just trying to find the different forms of languages. So it's like maybe your grandmother didn't have this language, but she had a feel knowing of her own language. The feel knowing is a language. Yeah, it is.
You guys are using the word language, and you're flip-flopping between language as a structure of legible signification and language as any kind of structured exchange. You know what I mean? Yeah. That's what's happening, I think. I mean, everything is a language if we use language in that sense. Like walking is a language too. But you know.
I think we have another question just at the back here.
Hello, thank you. My name is Marley. Definitely want to give thanks for this space. I want to thank you all for language. And what I mean when I'm saying it is language like fugitivity and wayward and fleeing and refusal. So my parents migrated to the US from Haiti, which is in a constant state of world ending, it feels. I was born in Brooklyn. I've been living in the Netherlands for 10 years now. And I feel like your work has given me language around my condition and my position as someone who is constantly leaving and like feeling wayward. However, I feel like often the language around people who leave home is often in a state of like fleeing as if afraid from a space of fear, or like it wasn't enough and so I'm moving towards something better, where I feel like I'm moving towards an otherwise and a waywardness. And I'm curious about your own relationships to fugitivity, especially now in the US, but also maybe not especially now. Maybe it has always constantly felt as it feels now. But yeah, just like your relationship to fugitivity, exile, leaving in your own like personal lives. Thank you.
Mike?
No, that's a great word for thinking. Yeah.
I mean, Sadia is great at naming shit. I'm just saying. I'm saying that's a superpower. Like, as much as I talk about certain things that exist outside of words, but the person who can find the right word, and it's always no academy is saying it's the right word, it's because people take it up. Fugitivity is taken up. We all in the wake, you know, and then that generates in the wake, and then a Ghidra. It's like all these kinds of things we're struggling, you know, to name what it is we're experiencing collectively and individually and spiritually and politically. Don't you think?
I mean, I agree. It's like so much of the imposition of hegemonic cognitive framework has made so much of just our experience, our history, our lives unthinkable. So partly like that language is like, oh, how do I just like try to break this imposition so I have another way of even perceiving and knowing in this condition, right? And I think and I think, you know, writers especially, that's the form of acute noticing, you know, but it's, so I would say that that's the way language is very important, because the imposed structures want us to understand world in a certain way, you know, a schema of life, a temporal framework, notions of distribution of like wealth and dispossession, And so for me, language just is like, it's like helping me pry something open, or maybe it's like a rock thrown through a plate glass window.
Quoting at the end of The Belly of the World, you're sort of quoting Audre Lorde. You say that, you know, fugitivity allowed those who were not meant to survive to sometimes do just that. And so I think a lot about how, like, all the forms of Black people surviving actually are fugitivity. And I like this idea, you know, I'm intensely disidentified with, you know, the sort of, like, the question even of the place of origin, not just like the you know, ethnicity or something and the nation to which you belong or a citizen, but, you know, the question of origination is, for Black folks, is, you know, like, it's like it's a knot that's impossible to unwind, particularly in diaspora, I think, and so I think that, yeah, like the how we appear or refuse to appear or you know, find a way to find each other. I mean, all of that feels like, you know, the fugitive life practice.
And I mean, I think, Precious, you also do that so much in these kind of like, these spaces you create. I mean, you know, as a gardener, I mean, you know, Precious will introduce all of these invasive things into, so there's already, even in that world, we've created another hierarchy of life. Those plants which should be eradicated, those which should be cultivated, those which are weeds, those which are flowers, and a lot of these things are ideological categories, right? It's a kind of human schema projected onto the world. So I don't know if you want to talk about the way you're like messing stuff up.
I think I'm always thinking about the openness of impossibility and the portal that comes out of that. So maybe for me, it's always like this resistance of trying to kill something that shouldn't exist. This continuality of being like, we need to destroy it, order it, and structure it. And what happens for me is like when you explode that and put all the impossibility together and the type of the openness that state of fugitivity proves, and the impossibility of the unknown for that wonder, for that new beginning, and for that weed to crack in that small spot where it's not supposed to be, then a miracle occurs. Yeah.
Thank you all so much. This was a really beautiful conversation, and I'm grateful to have witnessed it. Yeah, I think let's give our panel a round of applause and gratitude.
So thank you very much to our moderators, Dereka and Quincy. To our panelists, Alex, Pelumi, Precious, Cameron, Sadia, AJ, thank you. Tina, thank you. And thank you to our chefs, chef artists today, Janine, Emma, Reed. Reed and Emma will come to the front to introduce the menu. I know Emma is protesting, but you're coming. This is Reed. And Emma.
Hello, thank you, and also welcome in what is going to be Suitcase Economy, an experimental canteen. We're opening next week, so you have a little sneak peek. I first want to start with thanking Gabby and amazing Melly team that has made all of this possible, and it was beyond. I also want to thank Janine and Ima, without whom there would be no food. I will introduce quickly the meal, then I'm going to hand over the microphone to you, Ima. The meal is dairy-free and gluten-free. We have 2 stews. One is a pumpkin stew from North Nigeria. It's Misham Taji. I'm not sure if I pronounce it right, but it's based on a recipe from Yewande Komalafe, and the key ingredient is a fermented lotus seed bean from the tree, the Parkia bicolorosa, and the pumpkins in the stew are coming from my mom's and aunt's vegetable garden from Nel and Sean van Enkvoort, and from my uncle's farm, Gat van Enkvoort in Zevenum. It's in the south of the Netherlands, my hometown. And then there will be oxtail stew, which is an oxtail stew that Ima once made for me, or it's based on an oxtail stew that Ima once made for me, which is a recipe of your mom, Pisokon. And the stock base is a beef stock based on my grandma's recipe, Hendrika van Enkvoort. And we have some people that brought hot sauces with Suitcase from Tina and Sadia. And there's a homemade hot sauce also, and there will be side dishes, rice, plantain, and a quick pickle cucumber salad from based on a recipe from my mom. And at the bar there will be also rhubarb syrup, which is one of the staples of the canteen, and it was sourced via my uncle on a farm from Tij op de Hei. The floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I don't know what to say. Maybe how I met Ree, or how our relationship has become as intimate as it is, as our joy and our interest in fermentation. Like, we're both artists. And I couldn't hear a lot of the talk, but a lot what I did hear is about time. And I think about fermentation as another way of like grasping that. And one of the ways that we have talked about fermentation is a way of like, maybe it's an alternative document to cinema, in that it captures culture that's in the air, and we're in this weird place of like producing culture, but also consuming culture, and fermentation is maybe another place to kind of think about that. And then think about how what you can embed then into that culture that is also maybe an alternative in terms of nourishing certain bodies that I'm certainly committed to and interested in seeing surviving beyond a particular like point, basically. So I'll leave it as that. So like fermentation as like an alternative to like moving image.
That's it, folks. Thank you very much for spending the afternoon with us. Enjoy the food.
Hello, 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 hello. 1, 2, 3. We need a moment just to set everything up for you beautiful people. So if you can kind of keep that side of the bar free and this side, because we're going to be bringing out some very hot, juicy, scrumptious oxtail, and we don't want to be responsible for burning anyone. So if you can just kind of give us a minute, and actually what would be really ideal if you leave, and then come back, and then we'll have everything ready for you. Is that good? Okay, it's so good to see you. Thank you.